The beginning of a struggle. Caleb Johnson was not like most 8-year-olds. He was a boy with a spirit as bright as the sun, his energy contagious to everyone around him. With his wide brown eyes always sparkling with curiosity and his boundless enthusiasm for life, Caleb had an insatiable hunger for learning. His mother often teased him, saying, "One day, Caleb, you're going to ask so many questions, you'll become a genius before you hit middle school." He loved it when she said that because deep down, Caleb believed it to be true. He went to Oakwood Elementary, a school located in a quaint neighborhood known for its friendly community and tree-lined streets. The school had always been a place where Caleb felt safe, and he genuinely loved attending his classes, especially math, which was his favorite subject. It wasn't uncommon for Caleb to stay up late at night, asking his parents for just one more problem before bed. This particular morning was no different. Caleb bounded up the steps of the school, his backpack bouncing on his small shoulders, with his typical wide grin. He couldn't wait to get to class, where his teacher, Miss Blake, would be starting their new lesson on multiplication. Though Caleb had only been in her class for a few months, he had already begun to notice things about her that made him feel uneasy. Miss Blake was strict, stricter than any teacher Caleb had ever had. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it seemed forced. But more than that, Caleb often felt like she didn't notice him. While other kids in the class received warm compliments and encouraging words from her, Caleb's efforts seemed invisible, no matter how hard he tried. It confused him because he knew he was a good student, and he worked hard on his assignments. His parents always praised him for being diligent and focused, so why did it feel like Miss Blake never noticed? "Good morning, Miss Blake," Caleb chirped as he walked into her classroom that morning, just as he always did. "Take your seat, Caleb," she replied curtly, barely looking up from her desk. Her tone was indifferent, as though she was speaking to a stranger, not one of her students. Caleb hesitated for a second, but shrugged it off, choosing to focus on the excitement of the day's lesson instead. The classroom soon filled with the sounds of eager chatter as Caleb's classmates filed in. As always, he greeted his friends with a cheerful smile, and once seated, he took out his homework from the previous day and placed it neatly at the corner of his desk, just as Miss Blake had instructed. The lesson began, and it was one Caleb was particularly excited about: multiplying by sevens. Caleb had studied ahead the night before and was confident in his abilities. As soon as Miss Blake posed the first question, his hand shot into the air, his fingers wiggling with anticipation. But, as usual, her eyes drifted past him. "Emily," she called on another student instead. Caleb's hand slowly dropped, a small frown forming on his face. It wasn't the first time Miss Blake had overlooked him, and by now, it was starting to feel personal. 56, Emily answered, her voice filled with confidence. "Very good, Emily. Excellent work," Miss Blake praised, smiling warmly at her. Caleb watched, the disappointment growing inside him. Why didn't she ever call on him? He knew the answer. He always did. The lesson continued, and Caleb remained attentive, determined to prove himself through his work. He solved each math problem with precision and pride, his pencil flying across the page as he filled in the answers. When Miss Blake finally asked for volunteers to share their work, Caleb's hand shot up again, hopeful that this time she might choose him. But once more, Miss Blake's eyes skimmed over him. "Tyler, why don't you share your answer?" Tyler, a boy sitting 2 rows over, stood up and read his answer aloud. It was correct, and Caleb couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. It wasn't that Tyler didn't deserve the recognition. He did. But so did Caleb. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he never seemed to get Miss Blake's attention. "Excellent work, Tyler." Miss Blake beamed, her voice full of pride. As the day came to a close, Caleb quietly packed his things, trying to shake off the disappointment that lingered. He didn't understand why Miss Blake treated him differently. Was he doing something wrong? Was it his handwriting? His posture? Maybe he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. These questions swirled around in his mind as he walked towards the door. "Caleb," Miss Blake's voice called out, just as he was about to leave. Caleb turned, his heart skipping a beat. Maybe now she would tell him he did a good job after all. "Your homework from yesterday," she said, holding up his paper. "It's quite messy. You need to work on your handwriting." Caleb's brows furrowed in confusion. He had spent extra time on that homework, making sure his writing was neat and legible. He didn't understand why she thought it was messy. "I'm sorry, Miss Blake. I'll try harder next time," Caleb mumbled, his voice barely audible. "See that you do," she replied dismissively, already turning her attention to something else. Caleb walked out of the classroom feeling smaller than he had when he walked in that morning. Why did it feel like no matter what he did, it wasn't good enough for Miss Blake? He pushed the door open, stepping outside into the cool afternoon air, and spotted his dad leaning against their family car in the parking lot. David Johnson was everything a father should be: strong, kind, and always there when you needed him. His presence alone made Caleb feel like everything was going to be okay, no matter what. "Hey, champ," David called out, a warm smile spreading across his face as he opened his arms wide for Caleb. "How was school today?" Caleb's face lit up at the sight of his father, and he ran over to give him a big hug. "Dad, I thought Mom was picking me up today. I finished up at the office early and thought I'd surprise you," David said, ruffling Caleb's curly hair affectionately. "So tell me all about your day." Caleb hesitated for a moment. He wanted to tell his dad everything. About Miss Blake, about how she never seemed to notice him, and how she thought his handwriting was messy. But he didn't want to worry him. His dad worked hard, and Caleb didn't want to add to his stress. "It was good," Caleb finally said, forcing a smile. "We did multiplication today, and I knew all the answers." David grinned proudly. "That's my boy. I knew you'd ace it." As they drove home, Caleb chattered on about the day, choosing to focus on the positive and pushing the rest to the back of his mind. But even as he spoke, the weight of Miss Blake's indifference sat heavy in his chest, like a storm cloud hovering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to break. Little did Caleb know that storm was coming sooner than he thought, and it would change everything. The insult that shattered innocence. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Johnson household as Caleb sat at the kitchen table, scribbling on a piece of paper. His mother, Lisa, bustled around the kitchen, preparing breakfast while his father, David, sat reading the morning paper, occasionally sipping his coffee. The smell of pancakes filled the air, and the comforting sounds of family life surrounded Caleb. "Mom, can you check this problem?" Caleb asked, pushing his math workbook towards her. He had spent the previous night practicing his multiplication, eager to prove to Miss Blake that he was just as capable as the other students. "Of course, sweetheart," Lisa replied, wiping her hands on her apron before leaning over to inspect Caleb's work. Looks good to me. You've got it all correct, as usual." Caleb beamed. He loved it when his mom praised him, and it gave him the extra boost of confidence he needed. His parents had always supported his education, telling him that knowledge was power and encouraging him to always do his best. But lately, he had begun to doubt himself, especially after Miss Blake's remarks about his handwriting the previous day. "Maybe you can write a bit neater for Miss Blake, Caleb," his mother added, sensing the slight furrow in her son's brow. "Some teachers are particular about things like that, but it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. You're doing great, honey." "Yeah," Caleb mumbled, though inside, a tiny seed of doubt remained. He wanted to believe his mom, but why did it seem like no matter how much he tried, it was never enough for Miss Blake? Shaking off the thought, Caleb finished his breakfast and prepared for another day at school. Today, he promised himself, would be different. Today, he would show Miss Blake just how smart he really was. At Oakwood Elementary, the air was thick with the usual hum of school life. Students chatting in the hallways, lockers slamming, and the occasional sound of sneakers squeaking across the floors. Caleb walked into Miss Blake's classroom with a renewed sense of determination. He had worked extra hard on his homework the night before, ensuring his handwriting was as neat as possible. He couldn't wait for Miss Blake to see it. "Good morning, Miss Blake," Caleb said, offering his usual greeting. Miss Blake glanced at him, her expression as stiff and cold as always. "Good morning, Caleb. Take your seat." Caleb nodded, a small knot forming in his stomach. Something about her tone made him uneasy, but he brushed it off and took his seat. As the other students filed in, Miss Blake began the day's lesson, a continuation of multiplication, which Caleb was excited for. Once again, his hand shot up when Miss Blake asked the first question, but as usual, she ignored him and called on someone else. "Tyler, what's the answer to 7 times 9? Miss Blake asked. 63. Tyler responded confidently. "Very good," she praised, giving Tyler the same warm smile she seemed to reserve for certain students. Caleb's hand slowly lowered, the familiar sense of frustration creeping in. He couldn't understand why Miss Blake always overlooked him, but he was determined not to let it affect him. After all, he had his homework ready to turn in, and this time he was sure it would be perfect. As the lesson continued, Caleb focused intently on his work, solving each problem with precision. When Miss Blake finally called for the homework to be turned in, Caleb proudly placed his neatly written assignment on her desk, smiling up at her in anticipation. He waited for some sign of approval, a nod, or even just a glance, but Miss Blake didn't acknowledge him. "Thank you," she said flatly, flipping through the papers without looking at him. Caleb returned to his seat, trying not to let the disappointment sink in. Maybe she would give him some praise when she graded his work. He had done his best, and that was all that mattered. The rest of the day passed in a blur, with Caleb eagerly waiting for Miss Blake to hand back the homework. When she finally did, Caleb's heart raced as she walked towards him, a small stack of papers in hand. This was it. He had worked so hard, and now he was going to see the result. But when she placed his homework on his desk, his heart sank. Scribbled in red ink at the top of the page were the words that would haunt him for days. "This is garbage. Do better next time." Caleb stared at the paper, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, thinking maybe he had read it wrong, but there it was, written plainly for him to see. Garbage. His stomach twisted, and his hands began to tremble as he ran his fingers over the hateful words. Why would she write something like that? Caleb thought. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the insult. He had tried so hard, spent hours making sure his handwriting was neat, solving each problem correctly. And yet here was his teacher, calling his work garbage. Miss Blake continued handing out papers, as if nothing had happened, her face void of any emotion. Caleb wanted to say something, wanted to ask her why she thought his work was so bad, but his voice caught in his throat. The words wouldn't come out. His classmates began looking over their papers, some whispering to each other about their grades, but Caleb sat frozen, his eyes glued to the harsh red ink. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the sound around him had been sucked into a void. He felt like everyone was staring at him, even though no one actually was. Suddenly, Caleb felt like he didn't belong. Not in this classroom. Not in front of Miss Blake, who clearly didn't think much of him. Maybe she was right. Maybe he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Caleb quickly shoved his things into his backpack, trying to keep his head down as the other students filed out of the room. His cheeks burned with shame, and his vision blurred as tears threatened to spill over. He couldn't let anyone see him cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Just as he reached the door, Miss Blake called out to him. "Caleb, a word before you leave," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. Caleb hesitated, wiping at his eyes before turning to face her. He slowly walked back to her desk, dread creeping up his spine. What was she going to say now? "I expect better from you, Caleb," Miss Blake said, her tone sharp. "If you don't start putting in more effort, you're going to fall behind. Do you understand?" Caleb nodded, unable to meet her eyes. He wanted to tell her that he had put in all the effort he could, that he had spent hours on his homework, but the words wouldn't come. He felt too small, too insignificant. "You can go now," she dismissed him, turning back to her desk without another word. Caleb walked out of the classroom, his head hanging low. As he made his way to the school parking lot, where his dad was waiting, the weight of Miss Blake's words pressed down on him like a heavy stone. His father greeted him with the usual warmth, but Caleb couldn't bring himself to smile this time. "Hey champ, how was school today?" David asked, noticing the change in his son's demeanor. Caleb shrugged, avoiding his father's gaze. "It was fine," he muttered. David's eyes narrowed slightly in concern. He knew his son well enough to sense when something was wrong, but he didn't want to push. He figured maybe Caleb had had a rough day and would open up when he was ready. As they drove home, Caleb remained silent, staring out the window as the world passed by in a blur. The hateful words written on his homework echoed in his mind. Garbage. How could she say that to him? Why did she hate him so much? And more importantly, what had he done to deserve it? When they got home, Caleb went straight to his room, dropping his backpack on the floor before collapsing onto his bed. He stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing. Should he tell his parents? Part of him wanted to, but another part felt ashamed. Ashamed that his teacher thought so little of him. Ashamed that he couldn't seem to do anything right. But deep down, Caleb knew that this wasn't about his handwriting or his math skills. Something else was going on. Something that he couldn't quite understand. And soon, that something would come to light in a way no one could have predicted. The secret unveiled. Caleb lay awake in his bed that night, staring up at the ceiling. The darkness around him felt suffocating, and his mind raced with thoughts of Miss Blake's harsh words. He couldn't shake the image of that red ink, the way the word garbage had been written with such cruelty. It was as if she had wanted to hurt him. But why? Caleb had never done anything wrong, had never caused any trouble in class. He was just a kid who loved learning, a boy who wanted nothing more than to make his parents proud. The next morning, Caleb woke up with a pit in his stomach. For the first time in his life, he didn't want to go to school. The thought of facing Miss Blake again filled him with dread, but he didn't know how to explain that to his parents. When Lisa came into his room to wake him, Caleb pretended to be asleep, hoping she would let him stay in bed. "Caleb, honey, it's time to get up," Lisa said softly, pulling back his blankets. "You don't want to be late for school." Caleb groaned and rolled over, pulling the covers back up over his head. "I don't feel like going today, Mom," he mumbled, his voice muffled by the blankets. Lisa paused, her brow furrowing in concern. Caleb had never resisted going to school before. In fact, he usually woke up before his alarm, eager to get ready for the day. She sat down on the edge of his bed, gently pulling the covers down so she could see his face. "What's going on, sweetheart?" she asked, brushing a hand through his curly hair. "You love school. Is something bothering you?" Caleb hesitated, biting his lip as he debated whether or not to tell his mother the truth. A part of him wanted to tell her everything, to show her the hateful words Miss Blake had written on his homework and explain how much it hurt. But another part of him felt ashamed. He didn't want his parents to think he was weak or that he couldn't handle a little criticism from his teacher. "I'm just tired," Caleb said finally, his voice small. "Can't I stay home for one day?" Lisa's heart ached at the sight of her son's sad expression. Something was definitely wrong, but she knew that pushing him too hard might make him retreat even further. She sighed softly, placing a gentle hand on his back. "Okay, you can stay home today," she said, her voice laced with concern. "But if something's bothering you, Caleb, you know you can talk to me, right? You don't have to keep it all inside." Caleb nodded, though he didn't say anything. Lisa gave him a final kiss on the forehead before leaving his room, closing the door behind her. As soon as she was gone, Caleb felt a wave of relief wash over him. But that relief was short-lived, replaced quickly by the gnawing guilt that came from hiding the truth. Later that afternoon, as Caleb sat on the couch watching TV, David walked in from work, still in his suit and tie. His eyes immediately went to Caleb, who hadn't gone to school that day. David wasn't used to seeing his son at home during school hours, and it didn't take long for him to realize something was off. "Hey, champ," David said, sitting down next to Caleb on the couch. "I heard you didn't feel like going to school today. Everything okay?" Caleb shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor. His dad always had a way of making him feel like he couldn't hide anything, even when he tried. But still, Caleb wasn't sure if he was ready to talk about what had happened. He didn't want to worry his dad. "I'm fine," Caleb mumbled. "Just tired, I guess." David raised an eyebrow, not buying the explanation. "You know you can talk to me, right? Whatever it is, you don't have to deal with it on your own." Caleb's chest tightened. He wanted to talk to his dad, but something held him back. He wasn't sure why, but the thought of explaining how Miss Blake had treated him, how she seemed to single him out and write cruel things on his homework, felt overwhelming. David watched his son for a moment, sensing the internal struggle. He wasn't going to push Caleb, but he also wasn't going to let it go. He had noticed something different in Caleb's demeanor over the past few weeks, small changes that only a parent would pick up on. Caleb had always been energetic, bouncing with excitement to tell his dad about what he'd learned at school. But lately, he had grown quieter, more reserved, like he was carrying a burden too heavy for a child his age. "Caleb," David said gently, his voice calm and steady, "if something's going on at school, you need to tell us. It's okay if it's hard to talk about, but you don't have to go through it alone." There was a long silence before Caleb finally spoke. His voice was so quiet, David had to lean in to hear him. "Miss Blake doesn't like me," Caleb said, his eyes still fixed on the floor. David's brow furrowed. "What do you mean she doesn't like you?" Caleb hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. She never calls on me in class, even when I know the answer. And she always says my handwriting is messy, even when I try really hard. Yesterday, she wrote something really mean on my homework." David's expression darkened. He had always been proud of Caleb's academic efforts, and the thought that his son was being mistreated at school infuriated him. But he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He needed to understand the full picture first. "What did she write?" David asked, his voice still calm but laced with concern. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he recalled the words. He didn't want to repeat them, didn't want to feel the sting of that red ink all over again. But he knew he couldn't keep it to himself anymore. She wrote, "This is garbage. Do better next time," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking slightly. David's face hardened, and a storm of anger welled up inside him. How could a teacher, an adult entrusted with the care and education of children, say something so cruel to an 8-year-old boy? His fists clenched involuntarily as he fought to control his rising fury. "She wrote that on your homework?" David asked, his voice steady, but edged with barely contained anger. Caleb nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I tried really hard, Dad. I did everything right. I don't know why she doesn't like me." David pulled Caleb into a tight embrace, his heart breaking for his son. He could feel the tension in Caleb's small body, the way he had been holding in his pain for too long. David's protective instincts kicked in, and he knew that something had to be done. He wasn't going to let this go. No one, especially not a teacher, had the right to make his son feel worthless. "Caleb," David said softly, pulling back to look into his son's tear-filled eyes. "You are not garbage. You are smart, kind, and hardworking, and nothing Miss Blake says or writes can change that. Do you understand?" Caleb nodded, though his tears still spilled over. "We're going to figure this out," David continued, his voice filled with determination. "But first, I need you to know that you did nothing wrong. Sometimes people treat others unfairly because of things that have nothing to do with them. I don't know what Miss Blake's problem is, but I promise you, we're going to get to the bottom of it." David's mind was already racing, trying to figure out the best way to approach the situation. He didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but something about Miss Blake's treatment of Caleb seemed off. Why would a teacher target a child like this? It didn't make sense. "I'm going to talk to the school, okay?" David said. "We're going to get this sorted out." Caleb nodded again, though he still felt a deep sense of confusion. He didn't understand why Miss Blake treated him differently. What had he done to deserve it? As David held his son, he couldn't help but wonder the same thing. He had always taught Caleb to be kind, respectful, and hardworking. So why was his teacher, someone who should be supporting and encouraging him, tearing him down instead? The question gnawed at David, and he knew that the answer might be more complicated than he could have imagined. The next day, David took the morning off from work to go to Oakwood Elementary. He had called the school the previous evening and had set up a meeting with the principal, Mrs. Anderson. She was known for being fair and approachable, so David hoped she would take the situation seriously. When he arrived at the school, he was greeted by the sight of children playing on the playground, their laughter echoing through the air. It was a stark contrast to the tension he felt as he approached the main office. He had never been the type of parent to get involved in school matters, unless absolutely necessary, but this was different. This was about protecting his son. Mrs. Anderson greeted him with a warm smile as he entered her office. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Her office was lined with certificates and awards, evidence of her long career in education. "Mr. Johnson," confronting the truth. David sat across from Mrs. Anderson, his mind racing with thoughts of how to approach the issue delicately but firmly. His heart still ached for Caleb, replaying the conversation with his son over and over. The cruel words Miss Blake had written, and the apparent targeting of Caleb, had awakened a sense of righteous anger in him. But David knew that anger alone wouldn't solve this problem. He needed to remain composed, articulate, and most of all, effective in ensuring that Caleb received the justice he deserved. Mrs. Anderson folded her hands neatly on her desk, her expression warm but professional. "Mr. Johnson, I'm glad you could make it this morning. I understand there's a concern regarding Caleb's experience in Miss Blake's class." David nodded, sitting forward slightly, trying to keep his voice even despite the storm brewing inside him. "Yes, there is. I've noticed some troubling behavior from Miss Blake toward my son, Caleb. Over the last few weeks, he's been unusually quiet at home and hasn't been as eager to go to school. At first, I thought it was just regular school stress, or maybe a few bad days, but something happened recently that made me realize it's more than that." Mrs. Anderson's brow furrowed slightly as she listened, her gaze focused and attentive. "I'm very sorry to hear that. Caleb is such a bright and respectful student, so it's concerning to hear that he's having issues. Could you explain what happened?" David took a deep breath, the memory of Caleb's tear-filled eyes still fresh in his mind. "A few days ago, Caleb brought home his homework, and I saw a comment written by Miss Blake in red ink. She had written the words, 'This is garbage. Do better next time.' Caleb was devastated, and he's been trying so hard in her class. This kind of language is completely unacceptable, especially directed at an 8-year-old child." Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened in shock, and she immediately reached for a notepad, jotting down the details. "Garbage. That's deeply troubling. I can't imagine any teacher using that kind of language with a student, especially not Caleb. I'm so sorry that this happened to him, Mr. Johnson. I will absolutely look into it." David nodded but pressed on. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Anderson, but this isn't just about one incident. Caleb has also mentioned that Miss Blake rarely calls on him in class, even when he raises his hand and knows the answer. He feels like she's purposely ignoring him, and it's starting to affect his confidence. Mrs. Anderson frowned, clearly concerned. This doesn't sound like the Miss Blake I know. She's been a teacher here for several years, and we've never had any complaints of this nature before. But of course, we take every concern seriously, especially when it involves a child feeling targeted or mistreated. I'll need to speak with Miss Blake directly to hear her side, but please know that we will investigate this thoroughly. David appreciated the principal's professionalism, but there was something nagging at him, something deeper he couldn't quite put his finger on. It didn't make sense that Miss Blake, a seasoned teacher, would lash out at Caleb like this without cause. Was it personal? Was there something about Caleb that Miss Blake had an issue with, beyond academics? He wasn't about to leave the meeting without voicing his suspicions. Mrs. Anderson, David began carefully. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I can't help but wonder if there's more to this. I've always taught Caleb to treat everyone with respect, and he's never had issues with any of his other teachers. Is there any possibility that Miss Blake could be harboring some sort of bias against him? I hate to bring this up, but could it be because of Caleb's race? The room went still for a moment, and David's words hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion, and she sat back in her chair, clearly surprised. There was an uncomfortable pause as she gathered her thoughts. I understand why you might feel that way, Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Anderson said slowly, her tone measured. But I want to assure you that Oakwood Elementary takes pride in being an inclusive and diverse school. We have a strict policy against discrimination of any kind. That being said, we can't ignore the possibility of implicit bias, even if it's unconscious. David nodded, relieved that the principal wasn't brushing off his concerns but still feeling uneasy. I'm not saying it's intentional, but the way Caleb's described her behavior toward him, it feels targeted. He's a young black boy in her class, and if there's any chance that race is a factor, it needs to be addressed. Mrs. Anderson sighed, looking down at the notes she had taken. I understand your concerns, and I'll make sure we investigate this thoroughly. I'll speak with Miss Blake, review Caleb's academic record, and I'll also observe her class in the coming days to see if there's any noticeable pattern in her behavior toward him or other students. David appreciated Mrs. Anderson's willingness to take action, but he knew that an internal investigation might not be enough. Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. I trust you'll handle this appropriately, but I want to be clear. If we don't see a change, I'll be taking this further. Caleb deserves to be treated with respect, and I won't stand by if that's not happening. Mrs. Anderson nodded firmly. I understand, and I agree. Caleb deserves a positive learning environment, just like every other student. You have my word that we'll get to the bottom of this. That afternoon, after the meeting, David picked Caleb up from school, his thoughts still swirling from the conversation with the principal. Caleb seemed quieter than usual as he climbed into the car, his eyes downcast. Hey, buddy, David said, trying to keep his tone light. How was school today? Caleb shrugged, not looking up from his backpack as he fiddled with the zipper. It was okay, I guess. David's heart ached at the sight of his son's diminished enthusiasm. This wasn't the Caleb he knew, the one who used to excitedly tell him all about his day. He knew that the situation with Miss Blake was weighing heavily on his son, and it was affecting his self-esteem more than he let on. You know, David said gently, I talked to Principal Anderson today about what happened. She's going to look into it and make sure everything gets sorted out. You don't have to worry about it anymore, okay? Caleb glanced up at his dad, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Really? Is she going to talk to Miss Blake? Yes, she is, David confirmed. She's going to figure out why Miss Blake has been treating you that way, and she's going to make sure it stops. Caleb nodded slowly, though he still looked uncertain. But what if Miss Blake gets mad at me for telling? What if it gets worse? David felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. That's not going to happen, Caleb. And if it does, I'll make sure it's taken care of. You're not alone in this, okay? Your mom and I are here for you, and we're going to make sure you're treated fairly." Caleb gave a small nod, but David could tell that the damage had already been done. His son had lost trust in his teacher, and it would take time to rebuild his confidence. Meanwhile, back at Oakwood Elementary, Mrs. Anderson wasted no time in setting up a private meeting with Miss Blake. She had been going over Caleb's file and reviewing his academic history, and everything indicated that he was a bright, dedicated student with no behavioral issues. Nothing in his records suggested that he should be struggling in Miss Blake's class. When Miss Blake entered the principal's office later that day, she seemed calm and professional, as always. But Mrs. Anderson couldn't help but notice a subtle tension in the way Miss Blake carried herself, as if she were anticipating something unpleasant. "Miss Blake, thank you for meeting with me," Mrs. Anderson began, keeping her tone neutral but firm. "I wanted to discuss a concern that's been brought to my attention regarding one of your students, Caleb Johnson." Miss Blake's expression didn't falter, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes that Mrs. Anderson couldn't quite place. "Of course, Mrs. Anderson. What's the issue?" Miss Blake asked, her voice steady. Mrs. Anderson took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I've received a complaint from Caleb's father that you may have written an inappropriate comment on his homework, specifically the word garbage. I wanted to hear your side of the story before drawing any conclusions." Miss Blake's face remained impassive, but her response was quick, almost rehearsed. "I did write that comment, but it was taken out of context. Caleb's work that day was below the standard he's capable of, and I wanted to encourage him to do better." Mrs. Anderson frowned slightly. Encouragement is one thing, but calling a child's work garbage is hardly constructive feedback. Can you understand why Caleb and his parents might have been hurt by that comment? Miss Blake shifted in her seat, her gaze flickering briefly toward the window. "I didn't mean for it to be hurtful. It was a poor choice of words, and I regret that. But Caleb has been struggling to meet the expectations in my class, and I've been trying to push him to improve." Beneath the surface, Mrs. Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly as she considered Miss Blake's words. There was something about the teacher's explanation that didn't sit right. While she admitted to using the word garbage, her tone lacked the genuine remorse that Mrs. Anderson had hoped to hear. It was as if Miss Blake believed she was justified in her actions, which only deepened the principal's concern. Still, she wanted to give Miss Blake the opportunity to fully explain herself. "I understand that pushing students to meet high standards is important," Mrs. Anderson said carefully, "but it's also essential to foster a positive learning environment, especially for students as young as Caleb. The language we use as educators can have a lasting impact. Caleb is a bright, motivated child, and this incident has clearly affected his confidence. I'm worried that there may be a deeper issue here, one that goes beyond a single homework assignment." Miss Blake's jaw tightened, and she folded her hands in her lap. For a brief moment, her professional facade seemed to crack, revealing something colder beneath the surface. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Anderson," she said, her voice growing sharper. "But Caleb is not the only student in my class. I have 25 other children to consider, and I've noticed that some students, like Caleb, are falling behind because they lack focus. His handwriting is often sloppy, and he rushes through assignments. I've tried to encourage him to take more pride in his work, but it doesn't seem to be getting through to him." Mrs. Anderson listened intently, noting the subtle frustration in Miss Blake's voice. It was clear that she didn't see Caleb as a student deserving of additional patience or care. To Miss Blake, he was a problem to be managed, not a child to be nurtured. "But that still doesn't explain the use of the word garbage," Mrs. Anderson pressed gently. "Was there something specific about Caleb's work that made you feel such a harsh word was necessary?" Miss Blake hesitated, her eyes darting toward the floor for a brief moment. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost defensive. "It wasn't personal. I've used strong language with other students before. Sometimes it's what they need to snap out of bad habits. Caleb's parents may not understand that, but I'm trying to prepare these kids for the future. They need to know when their work isn't good enough." Mrs. Anderson's lips pressed into a thin line. She could sense the rationalization creeping into Miss Blake's defense, but what concerned her more was the underlying attitude toward Caleb. There was something off, something that wasn't being said outright. Mrs. Anderson had seen this kind of dynamic before. Teachers who felt threatened or frustrated by certain students, but didn't fully recognize their own biases. "I'm concerned, Miss Blake," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I want to make sure that Caleb and all of your students are being treated with the same level of respect and care. There's also another issue that was brought to my attention." Caleb's father mentioned that Caleb feels he's being ignored in class, that you rarely call on him when he raises his hand. "Can you explain why that might be?" Miss Blake's expression hardened, and for the first time, there was a flash of irritation in her eyes. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest. "I don't have any personal issue with Caleb, if that's what you're implying. I manage my classroom fairly. Caleb's behavior is often disruptive. He talks to the other students when he should be focusing, and he doesn't always follow instructions. I call on the students who are engaged and ready to participate." Mrs. Anderson made a mental note of the shift in Miss Blake's tone. The defensiveness was growing, and there was a subtle shift toward blaming Caleb for his own mistreatment. This wasn't uncommon in situations where implicit bias was at play. Teachers, often without realizing it, could develop negative perceptions of certain students based on race, behavior, or other factors. And those perceptions, even if unspoken, influenced how they treated those students. "Disruptive," Mrs. Anderson repeated, her voice calm but probing. "That doesn't seem consistent with Caleb's record in other classes. I've reviewed his file, and his previous teachers have noted that he's a diligent student who participates eagerly in class. Is it possible that there's been a misunderstanding, or that Caleb is reacting to how he's being treated in your classroom?" Miss Blake's eyes flashed with something unreadable. Was it resentment? Discomfort? For a split second, her mask slipped again, and Mrs. Anderson saw a glimpse of the deeper frustration the teacher harbored. "With all due respect, Mrs. Anderson," Miss Blake said, her voice clipped, "Caleb may have been a model student in other classrooms, but in mine, he struggles. I can't be expected to give special treatment to one child when I have a whole class to manage." Mrs. Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. Special treatment. That phrase raised a red flag, especially in the context of what David had suggested earlier, that Caleb might be facing discrimination. The idea that Miss Blake saw treating Caleb fairly as special treatment hinted at a deeper bias, whether Miss Blake was aware of it or not. "Miss Blake, it's not about special treatment," Mrs. Anderson said firmly. "It's about ensuring that every child in your classroom feels valued and supported. Caleb is expressing that he feels singled out and ignored. As educators, we have to be mindful of how our actions, intentional or not, affect our students." Miss Blake's lips thinned, and she uncrossed her arms, her posture rigid. "I understand your concerns, but I'm doing the best I can with the resources and time I have. If Caleb's parents are unhappy with his progress, perhaps they should consider hiring a tutor or getting him additional help outside of school." Mrs. Anderson felt a surge of frustration rise within her. It was clear now that Miss Blake wasn't willing to take responsibility for her behavior toward Caleb, and worse, she was deflecting the blame onto the child and his family. This was no longer just a matter of poor communication or a single harsh comment. It was a deeper issue, one that required serious intervention. "I think we need to take a step back here," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice firm but measured. "This is not about placing blame on Caleb or his family. This is about ensuring that he is receiving the same level of respect and support as any other student in your classroom. I'm going to ask that we bring Caleb's parents into this conversation so that we can address these concerns together and find a solution that works for everyone." Miss Blake's eyes widened slightly at the mention of involving the Johnsons directly. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before nodding, though her expression remained stiff. "Of course," she said, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. "I'm happy to meet with them." Later that evening, David sat with Lisa at the dinner table, his mind still spinning from the day's events. He had told her about his meeting with Mrs. Anderson, but the full weight of the situation hadn't hit him until now. The more he thought about Miss Blake's treatment of Caleb, the angrier he became. This wasn't just about a teacher being tough on a student. This was about Caleb being made to feel inferior, about him being singled out for reasons that had nothing to do with his abilities or behavior. "I don't trust her, Lisa," David said, pushing his food around his plate. "There's something about Miss Blake that doesn't sit right with me. It's not just that she called his work garbage. There's something else going on. I think she's targeting him." Lisa's face was etched with worry. She had been quiet, processing everything David had told her about his meeting with Mrs. Anderson. "Do you really think it's because of—" She trailed off, her voice faltering. David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know for sure, but it's starting to feel like that. Caleb's never had a problem with any of his other teachers. He's always been a good student. But now, suddenly, he's being told that his work is garbage, that he's not good enough. It doesn't make sense." Lisa frowned, her eyes filled with concern. "Do you think we should pull him out of her class? Maybe request a transfer?" David shook his head. "I don't want to make any decisions like that just yet. Mrs. Anderson seems like she's taking this seriously, and she's going to meet with us and Miss Blake together. I want to give them a chance to address it before we do anything drastic." Lisa nodded, though her worry didn't fade. "I just hate seeing Caleb like this. He's such a bright kid, and now he's doubting himself because of one teacher." David reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're going to fix this. Caleb's not alone in this, and neither are we. We'll make sure he's treated with the respect he deserves." As they sat there, holding hands in the quiet of their dining room, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something deeper was at play, something that wouldn't be resolved easily. But no matter what, he was ready to fight for his son. And he wouldn't stop until Caleb felt safe, valued, and free to be the brilliant, curious boy he had always been. A week later, the day of the meeting arrived. David and Lisa sat in Mrs. Anderson's office, their hands tightly clasped together as they waited for Miss Blake to arrive. Tensions rising. David and Lisa sat side by side in the cramped, fluorescent-lit office of Mrs. Anderson, the weight of their anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Both of them had come prepared for the meeting, David with a firm resolve, and Lisa with a quiet determination to ensure that their son, Caleb, was treated fairly. It had been a long week of tension and sleepless nights, filled with whispered late-night conversations about Caleb's future and the growing frustration over Miss Blake's behavior. Their son had become more withdrawn, more uncertain of himself with each passing day. Caleb had stopped sharing stories about his school day altogether, instead retreating into the solitude of his room after dinner, barely making eye contact when he did talk. It was as though a cloud had settled over him, dimming the bright spirit they knew so well. This meeting was more than just a conversation. It felt like a battle for Caleb's sense of self-worth. Mrs. Anderson sat behind her desk, her usual warm demeanor replaced with a professional calm. She had spent the last week observing Miss Blake's class and talking to a few of Caleb's peers, trying to get a clearer picture of what was happening. Though nothing she'd seen had been overtly wrong, there was something subtle in Miss Blake's interactions with Caleb, a lack of acknowledgement, a dismissiveness that, while hard to quantify, couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Anderson had seen enough to know that this was a delicate situation, one that needed to be handled with care. The door to the office opened, and Miss Blake stepped inside. David felt an immediate wave of tension settle over the room. She was dressed in her usual professional attire, her expression calm, though her eyes betrayed a hint of guardedness. Miss Blake gave a curt nod to the Johnsons before sitting down in the chair across from them. "Thank you all for coming today," Mrs. Anderson began, her voice steady but serious. I know this is a difficult conversation, but it's important that we address the concerns Caleb's parents have raised. We're all here because we want what's best for Caleb, and I believe the best way forward is to be open and honest about what's been happening." Miss Blake nodded stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. "Of course," she said, her tone cool but polite. "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter." David leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on Miss Blake. He wasn't going to let her sidestep the issue. "I'm here because my son, Caleb, has been coming home feeling like he doesn't matter in your class," he said, his voice firm. "He feels like he's being ignored and singled out. And then there was the comment you wrote on his homework, the one where you said his work was garbage. I need to understand why you thought that was an appropriate thing to say to an 8-year-old child." Miss Blake blinked, her face remaining impassive. "As I mentioned to Mrs. Anderson, it was a poor choice of words," she replied evenly. "I've already expressed my regret about that. I wasn't intending to insult Caleb. I was trying to push him to do better. His work wasn't up to the standard I know he's capable of, and I wanted to make that clear by calling it garbage." David shot back, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to stay calm. "That's not how you push a child to do better. That's how you make them feel like they're not good enough, like their effort doesn't matter." Miss Blake's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "I've been teaching for many years, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice laced with a touch of condescension. "I know how to challenge my students. Caleb isn't the only one who's received critical feedback. I have high expectations, and I hold all of my students to them. That's part of my job." Lisa, who had been quiet up until this point, spoke up. Her voice was soft but firm. "We're not asking you to lower your expectations for Caleb," she said. "We're asking you to treat him with the same respect you would give to any other student. He comes home feeling like he's being ignored, like no matter how hard he tries, it's never enough for you. That's not just about expectations. That's about how you're making him feel in your classroom." Miss Blake's posture stiffened slightly, but she remained composed. "I'm sorry that Caleb feels that way," she said, though there was an edge to her voice that didn't quite match the apology. "But I treat all of my students fairly. If Caleb feels ignored, it's certainly not intentional. There are 26 students in my class, and I can't always give every child the same amount of attention in every lesson." David clenched his fists under the table, doing his best to keep his temper in check. Miss Blake's deflection was infuriating, and it was becoming clearer with every word that she wasn't willing to take responsibility for the impact she was having on Caleb. Mrs. Anderson, sensing the growing tension, stepped in. "Miss Blake, I've had the opportunity to observe your class over the past week, and while I didn't see anything explicitly wrong, I did notice that Caleb seems to receive less engagement from you compared to some of the other students. It's subtle, but it's there. He's raising his hand frequently, but he's often overlooked. Can you help us understand why that might be?" Miss Blake's expression heightened, her frustration becoming more evident. "As I said, there are many students in my class who need my attention. I try to balance that as best as I can. Caleb does participate, but there are times when his focus isn't where it should be. He tends to get distracted or talks to other students during lessons. I call on the students who are engaged and ready to contribute." David could feel the heat rising in his chest. "So, what you're saying he's not engaged enough to deserve your attention?" he asked, his voice tense. "You think he's not trying hard enough? Because I see a kid who comes home every night and works his heart out on his homework, only to get told that his best effort is garbage. That doesn't sound like a kid who's not engaged to me." Miss Blake's eyes flashed with a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, but she kept her voice measured. "Mr. Johnson, I'm not saying Caleb isn't trying. I'm saying that his behavior in class has room for improvement. I'm not the only teacher who has students who need extra guidance, but I can't give him all of my attention when I have a whole classroom to manage." Lisa jumped in again, her voice trembling slightly as she fought to remain calm. It's not about giving him all your attention, Miss Blake. It's about giving him the same opportunities as the other students. Caleb is starting to believe that he's not good enough, and that's coming from how he feels in your class. Mrs. Anderson glanced between the two sides, the tension growing palpable. She had hoped this meeting would bring about a constructive dialogue, but it was quickly devolving into a standoff. She needed to get to the root of the issue. Miss Blake, Mrs. Anderson said, her tone taking on a more authoritative edge, I understand that teaching a large class is a challenge, but what concerns me most is Caleb's perception of how he's being treated. Whether or not it's intentional, the impact is very real for him. He feels ignored, and his parents feel that this may be more than just a classroom management issue. Miss Blake's face remained unreadable, but there was a tension in her posture that suggested she was growing increasingly uncomfortable with where the conversation was headed. David decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Miss Blake's. I don't want to believe this is about race, he said, his voice calm but pointed. But I can't ignore the fact that Caleb's the only black boy in your class, and he's the only one who seems to be treated this way. I've taught him to respect everyone, but I need to know if he's being treated differently because of who he is. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Miss Blake's eyes widened ever so slightly at the accusation, and for a moment, she seemed to falter. Her gaze flickered between David and Mrs. Anderson, a flash of something akin to indignation crossing her face. Mr. Johnson, she began, her voice tight with controlled anger, I assure you that race has nothing to do with how I treat Caleb. I treat all of my students the same, regardless of their background. I find it deeply upsetting that you would suggest otherwise. David's jaw tightened. I'm not suggesting it. I'm asking. Because from where I'm sitting, it sure looks like my son is being treated differently, and I need to know why. Mrs. Anderson quickly intervened, sensing that the conversation was spiraling into dangerous territory. Let's all take a breath, she said, holding up her hand. This is a sensitive issue, but it's important that we address it head-on. Miss Blake, I understand that you may feel defensive, but I want to make it clear that we're here to support Caleb and ensure that he feels safe and respected in your classroom. Miss Blake's face flushed slightly, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, her fingers twisting in her lap. I don't know what else to say, she muttered. I've never treated